Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle, and I am your host, Chris Angle. Along with me are my co-host, Rick Samuelson, a venture capitalist on the West Coast, and Remy Canario, a political analyst, currently out of New York City. It's good to see you guys.
Good to see you. Good to see you, Chris.
This week, the concept for consideration is free speech, and the application are the Trump rallies. The purpose of the philosophical angle is to analyze the nature and essence of concepts being used in current media. So let's take this concept and its application, and let's go ahead and examine. Well, lately we've had protesters at a couple of Trump rallies. I believe it's either Ohio and Phoenix, and one, a protester rushes the stage, and in the other there's been some physical protests. And the thing about them is that they've gone from just a regular protest, which is people writing or analyzing or putting up signs, a peaceful protest, and it's gone beyond that with an addition of a physical action. And so with the physical action, it now becomes escalates to a one of physically objecting to the other's free speech. So it's I feel, a disturbing consideration and a disturbing set of events that are starting to happen, unfold. And I believe that the trend will continue and will accelerate against the front-running Republican candidate for the President of the United States for the nomination later on this summer. And so I'd like to ask why. Why is this happening? And well, I mean, he is the front-running nominee, and he's a very controversial figure. And so I can see that people will start to discuss him and start to have protests, which is fine. This is the nature of debate. But and he's not really the traditional GOP establishment type of figure, and so even within the GOP, he's a controversial figure. But so is Ronald Reagan. And probably the nature of that is that he is vehemently anti-politically correct. And this is something that would particularly rile up the energies of the left. And so why would the left become particularly interested in protesting Donald Trump? In fact, I suspect that and there are some reports in the media that these protesters are actually paid protesters from MoveOn.org. And why would they have to pay protesters to stir up trouble at a Trump rally? And I believe it's because of the philosophy of the Democratic left that they believe, or I believe that they believe, that the other individual that they're dealing with, they believe that he is inherently has bad motives, and that the nature of humans is that they are not inherently good. And so so when the left believes that the other individual becomes into cooperation with somebody else and constructs agreements and covenants to produce something, that there is an inherent injustice, that it's going to be unfair because one will try to exploit naturally the other. And because of this philosophy that one is inherently will try to exploit the other, they seek to employ more regulation and governmental interference in society to prevent this unfairness from happening. And so they want to regulate everything and prevent exploitation. And I believe that this end is all-consuming on the Democratic left, and they feel that Trump personifies this. And for this, they create an ethic of the ends justifies the means. Because the end is to create fairness, and so any means to get there is justified because the end is ultimately fair. Well, when it comes to the candidate Trump's speech and rallies, there can be no government interference because of the First Amendment, and it's America's adherence to free speech. And so this is unregulated. And thus they feel they need to take matters into their hands, using their own right to First Amendment, to quash the free speech of Trump by shouting him out or rushing the stage or creating commotions or whatever. And but I don't think that's really ethical. The first dimension of a peaceful protest is, of course, their right to the First Amendment. But when you get beyond that and go to rushing the stage, or in other words, adding a physical element to it, then I believe it's unethical. But I do not see any end to it, and I feel that and I predict that this type of protest against the front runner will accelerate in the near future, and all the rallies and will become greater, and it might even get to the point of the 1968 Democratic Convention, where the left was protesting the left. The anti-war left was protesting Johnson's administration's left of prosecuting the war. But let me hear what you guys have to think. It's an interesting subject. Remy, why don't you give us your views on this subject?
Sure thing. I think that the Trump campaign has had a flavor of violence about it from day one. I mean, who can forget after the horrible news that some white men in Boston had assaulted a Mexican homeless man simply because of his ethnicity, when Trump responded to that by saying that they were good Americans and they just wanted what was best for their country. People of color have felt threatened at his rallies for the entire duration of this campaign season. People have been roughed up. And so we have a long-standing cycle of violence that has already accompanied these rallies that he's been holding. And now what we're seeing for the first time is that it isn't all coming from Trump's supporters. We're seeing that the iron law of imitation in warfare is finally starting to assert itself, and people on the left are imitating the violence that already existed in these campaigns. Furthermore, I must strongly object to the idea that MoveOn.org somehow we should think that that's the likeliest reason that they paid for people to actually disrupt this, that the violence did happen in these rallies. That seems to be a perfect example of what you were decrying on the left, of questioning people's motives and believing that they're evil without giving them due consideration. Is it really so hard to believe that with everything that Trump has said and with the violence that his supporters have shown, that someone couldn't be moved to violence in opposition to his platform of their own free will? Granted, that is not a form of expression that anyone should support. But I do think that there's a simpler explanation and also a more generous one in believing that this came from true sentiments against the Trump narrative and against the Trump platform.
Say, before I get to Rick, you mentioned, what was that, the iron law, something?
The iron law of imitation in warfare. It has been said, and it does seem to be true, that when two parties are fighting, whether it's countries, politicians, that they whatever one candidate does or one nation does, the other tends to eventually do as well, and so it becomes an escalation cycle where they come to resemble each other more and more.
You talking about politically only or political plus?
It happens in terms of warfare, in terms of the kinds of weapons that are used. It happens in terms of rhetoric. Any time where there's conflict between two opposing parties, the strategies and tactics of one tend to be co-opted by the other.
You want to give me an example?
World War I, the use of mustard gas, for example.
Okay.
Or simply in American politics, the language that we've seen of illegitimacy on both sides creep into our political discourse. I'd like to think that it started on the right, but now we certainly see figures on the left trying to delegitimize the candidates on the right.
So it's really a matter of escalation. When one escalates, the other escalates.
Exactly.
Okay. Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, well, in respect of Mr. Trump, much like the Kardashians, he feeds on press coverage. And the more spectacular the press coverage, the happier I think his campaign is, frankly. And to that extent, he is so outwitted the U.S. press that he's left them looking like a ship of fools. Sadly. If the left want to see Mr. Trump get more press attention, almost the exclusion of any other candidates for the Republican nomination, then I would suggest they undertake more protests, because the press will dutifully cover it in all its lurid detail to the exclusion of the issues, which is what they do best. And Mr. Trump will ride that wave right into the Republican nomination. I mean, I think that's frankly his plan. And so I think he welcomes all of this. On a separate note, these sorts of protests, and whether they're sponsored by MoveOn.org or not, I think it's really beside the point. You see on college campuses the precedent for this kind of thing. There was a lecture on free speech at Yale late last year, and what actually happened, and this is recorded, is that students spit on the participants in the debate. They spit on them. So this kind of, call it rude, call it interrupting, call it whatever you want, this sort of behavior, and it's been seen on other campuses too, where students storm debates, throw things at the debaters, that kind of thing. If there's ample precedent for this, and so I tend to agree with Chris. On the one hand, you're going to see a lot more of it, justified or not. That there is emerging within the left, because of the whole politically correct movement, a notion that there are certain corridors within which debate can occur. In other words, if you talk about subjects that are outside of those corridors, it should somehow be shut down or suppressed in some way, that there's a justification for that. And there is ample precedent for that on many, many campuses, whether it involves disinvitation of certain speakers, which has happened repeatedly, or outright intervention in a debate or a lecture as it occurs.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So, sadly, I think what is happening now is feeding into further supporting the Trump campaign. And I personally am not a supporter of Trump. I think he's unprincipled. I think his policies, in many cases, are completely unworkable, such as they are. And I think he's going to continue to remain vague and contradictory and mainly focused on sound bites through Twitter, if anything. That seems to be his preferred mode of communication. And use a kind of Barnum and Bailey style approach to achieving as much notoriety and as much publicity as he possibly can.
Well, it's true. He's not spending much, and because he's got all the press time, so so he's done very well with that, as opposed to the other presidential candidates in the Republican Party who have spent tens of millions of dollars to no effect. And I believe that really inherently it's because he's got a couple of policies that are ringing popular amongst the GOP and the GOP followers, and even some Democrats, I guess, are coming over, and because the primaries are at a voting level that has not been seen in ages on the Republican side. But there's you mentioned something here that I'd like to bring up to you guys. Is this second dimensional protest with energy, with the action, not only peaceful but adding into the a little bit of action or violence or protesting or rushing a stage or getting into a fight or shouting down the opponent. I think I don't see that on the right so much. I think that's almost in the province of the left. Their use of these tactics throughout modern history, and even back in the Stone Age when I was a student, that was used in the speeches when a Republican such as William F. Buckley would come to campus, and they would come in and try to shut him down by shouting, and it was fairly clever. In a couple of instances, they would come in and go into different parts throughout the audience, and then not all together, just one after the other one. When one would leave, then the other one would start, and it caused havoc with the speeches. But be that as may, so let me see what you guys have to think about that.
Well, Chris, I'm not going to pretend to have any particularly deep knowledge of the history of protest, but there is a question of selection bias here. People who are young tend to be on the left. People who are young also tend to be the ones who take extreme action in real life, so that they're more prone to risk taking. They're more prone to violence. It seems natural that younger people would be more inclined to do these kinds of things, and so I don't think that there's necessarily an explanation that has to do with the politics of it, unless you can account for that selection bias.
Rick, any comment on that?
Well, I come back to the sad state of public dialogue in this particular presidential campaign. In a way, Mr. Trump's antics also take the heat off of Hillary Clinton. I mean, why should she have to talk about material issues that matter when Trump is out there making a fool of himself? In my opinion, okay, that's only my opinion. And sucking up all the oxygen in the room. And he doesn't certainly have to talk about substantive public policy issues. or he doesn't have to much, except these, this sort of soundbite approach. And therefore, it's a kind of dumbing down, in my opinion, of the whole public debate at a time when, with the country suffering from $19 trillion in total federal debt, with Middle Eastern policy in complete disarray, with Russia on the march, with China on the march. I mean, you would think you would want to see a much more sober assessment of the real issues than what we're getting. And I blame the press for their utter stupidity in falling into Mr. Trump's trap.
And that trap.
Like to respond to that.
Go.
No, I see what you're saying, Richard, but I do think that there is something more substantive to this than simply a clown show, although that certainly is a big part of it. I mean, if you look at Bernie Sanders and you look at Trump, essentially what we have going on in this election is a real conversation about changing the social contract in America. And I think that on the part of Trump, that has been a discussion that has been largely free of specifics, largely free of real policies. But I do think that there is a lot of desire in this country to have a new social compact that reflects the changes, the economic changes that we've seen over the past 40 years or so. So I wouldn't dismiss it as simply a circus, although it has those elements, because I think that it is a very important conversation, and that the fact that these protests have escalated to the point where they are is a reflection of how strongly felt these convictions are. Now, I would love to see them channeled in a more productive kind of way, and I think you just have to look at Bernie Sanders rallies to see what that could look like.
Rick, I got to admit, you have a point in the sense that Trump and really several of the other GOP candidates have not really been putting forth enough of the serious issues before the public through the media. And for example, I know that Trump has advocated a 15% corporate taxation, but he never speaks about it. And same with the others. This is something that I believe will create jobs more than anything else. Is a corporate tax decrease, and of course the other issues out there, as you mentioned, in the Middle East and everything else. It's definitely not talked about very much. Okay, guys, last word for either one of you. We've only got a few minutes to go here. Go ahead, Remy.
Well, I'm not optimistic about the outcome of all this. I'll say that here and now. I don't think it's going to bring the best out for either party in terms of the debate going forward. And I wish I could see a different outcome, but at the moment I don't.
What do you wish that you're not going to be able to see? Why are you not optimistic, or what
because I think, let's assume Mr. Trump becomes the Republican nominee. I think you're going to see a mudslinging contest between the Trump camp and the Hillary Clinton camp, because she's obviously going to be the nominee, of the likes of which we haven't seen since maybe the Civil War.
Well, I think the fireworks will be as interesting as anything that we can possibly imagine. Remy, last words.
I think we're going through a kind of atavistic, violent kind of transition in our discourse. And unfortunately, it's very ugly right now. But I think that if politicians on either side are doing their jobs, they'll look at the support that Trump has had and put together a policy platform that address the legitimate concerns that his supporters have. I think that this is a moment that has been too long in coming, and so while I bemoan the state of this campaign as much as anyone else, I do ultimately think that it's productive, because there is a huge political opportunity, and whoever can solve that problem is going to do this country a big favor.
Okay, well said, and I agree. Thanks very much, guys, for this edition of the Philosophical Angle, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.